In 1956, Emil Sondhi topped the Indian Civil Service, one of the toughest examinations in the world. He opted to join the Indian Foreign Service, even though he abandoned it 6 years later to take a larger platform in national politics. He had served in Prague, and he had also served in the Permanent Mission of India to the UN in New York. He resigned in 1962, a year before I joined the Foreign Service. But I was aware of his formidable reputation as a fearless and free-thinking diplomat. I had the privilege of meeting Professor Sondhi from time to time, and I was struck by his burning patriotism and his strong belief that India had a larger role to play in the world. It is my assessment that Emil Sondhi was the best external affairs minister India never had. Many of his ideas sounded radical and were unacceptable to the policy establishment at that time. For example, during the Cold War period, when India was swearing by the mantra of non-alignment, Professor Sondhi challenged it by proposing an alternative policy of non-appeasement. It was curiously phrased, but in essence, his argument was that India should go beyond the passive idea of equidistance between the major powers and seek closer partnerships with most of the global powers like France and Germany. This seems hardly radical today, especially after the Prime Minister of India has concluded a very successful state visit to Germany, France and Canada. As for non-alignment, it has become a mantra more to be chanted than to be followed as a guideline. So Professor Sondhi was actually right, way ahead of his time. Professor Sondhi also believed that India should play a major role in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Here too, his ideas have already become a major plank in India's foreign policy. The change took place in 1992 when Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao declared a Look East policy for India, which has since been renamed as the Act East policy by Prime Minister Modi. Mr. Sondhi had two other passions dear to his heart, and these are causes which I personally have great sympathy with, and these were the liberation of Tibet and the establishment of closer relations with Israel. It must have warmed his heart when in 1992, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao announced the exchange of diplomatic missions with Israel. I modestly played a role in this when I was posted in Washington. The goal of a liberated Tibet, however, remains unfulfilled and at the moment seems unlikely to take place in the near future. But let it be said, Professor Sondhi was very close to the Dalai Lama and in fact was his Indian proposer for the Nobel Peace Prize, which he got in 1989. Sadly, the Dalai Lama's eminently sensible suggestion for religious and cultural autonomy for the Tibetan people under the sovereignty of China has been rejected by the Chinese government. Well, who knows? One day, even this cause may also be proved right, and perhaps the suffering people of Tibet will find justice at last. Professor Sondhi lived to see another of his dreams fulfilled, of India as a strong, secure power with nuclear weapons, playing its role, its rightful role as a global player. So we remember Emil Sondhi today for his analytical clarity, his unfazed optimism, and his vision of a vibrant India. It is to preserve his ideas that Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi and the Sondhi family have established and nurtured two separate trusts in his memory. On this occasion today, we miss the presence of one of Professor Sondhi's closest friends, his comrade in arms and fellow diplomat, Ambassador S.J.S. Chatwal. Ambassador Chatwal was a year senior to Mr. Sondhi in the Foreign Service and remained in close touch with him even as his own very distinguished diplomatic career took him to Madrid, Havana, Colombo, Ottawa, and other places. It was with Ambassador Chatwal's help that Mrs. Sondhi ran the trust and instituted the M.L. Sondhi Prize. Unfortunately, Ambassador Chatwal passed away recently, leaving a large void which is very difficult to fill. Before I conclude, a word about Professor M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics. This prize is awarded every year to distinguished personalities who have contributed significantly to our understanding of international relations or have helped promote India's foreign policy objectives. I can think of no person more deserving of this honor than Professor Aaron Friedberg, one of the seminal thinkers and analysts of international affairs in the 21st century. In his numerous scholarly works, he has analyzed the decline of the British Empire, the emergence of the United States as a single superpower, and the unfolding challenge by China of US hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. Professor Friedberg has impeccable intellectual pedigree, having been mentored in the realist school of international affairs by the likes of Andrew Marshall and Samuel Huntington. So, in conclusion, let me once again welcome you most warmly to our function today, and I look forward to listening to the speeches by our chief guest, Mr. Trivedi, and our recipient of the M.L. Sondhi Prize, Professor Aaron Friedberg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mansingh. I'm going to just expand a little bit on the career of our honoree today, Professor Friedberg. So he is, of course, a scholar of international relations, but he's someone whose work is informed, I think, by a very deep sense that a liberal and democratic world order is morally important, and that the maintenance of this order cannot be divorced from a willingness to actually stand up to threats to it. As a consequence, he not only engages in scholarly work, which he does prodigiously, but also institution building and public service. In this very comprehensive engagement with the world of politics, I think he is a man that the late Professor Sondhi would have recognized as a kindred soul. So let me expand a bit on each of the components of Professor Friedberg's activity. He is, of course, a scholar. He received his degrees from Harvard, finishing a PhD in 1987 with Samuel Huntington as his thesis advisor. He then moved to Princeton University, which is where he has been since, and is now full professor. His thesis work and his first book were concerned at that point with what was one of the many rounds of worries about American decline. So he had the excellent idea of studying another power transition, this time from the British Empire around the turn of the previous century, so around 1900. And so the idea was that at that time, Britain, which had more or less dominated the high seas around the world, was faced with rising challengers. These were Japan and the United States as naval challengers. Advances in the building of railroads had rendered land powers, which were formerly somewhat insular, such as Germany and Russia, capable of projecting power to much longer distances. And so around 1900, the British Empire had to deal with these rising challenges and try and decide what resources to assign to countering these threats. India plays a role in this story. Lord Curzon was then Viceroy of India, and the defense of Afghanistan became an issue that the British Empire had to deal with, and that's one of the things discussed in his book. So this was it's really a wonderful book, which I highly recommend. It gives you a certain sense of what happens when a great power is faced with these challenges and what trade-offs have to be engaged in. He then turned his attention, and soon thereafter, of course, the Cold War came to a quick end, and so he turned his attention to rethinking how the United States had actually prevailed in the Cold War. And so his second book, which is called In the Shadow of the Garrison State, was interested in the question of how the United States had successfully prosecuted the Cold War without allowing itself to become a garrison state in which absolutely everything was dominated by the requirement of maintaining a global military presence. And the thrust of that book was that there was a long tradition of American anti-statism, belief in minimal government, which served very effectively to check the interests of those people who might have wanted to turn the United States into a garrison state. And the result was that American ingenuity and entrepreneurship thrived. And so eventually the sheer weight of American economic and political and social success was responsible for a power imbalance, which the Soviet Union eventually was not able to withstand. So from this, Aaron learned the importance of maintaining a liberal order at home, and which informs his work till today. Even before this time, he began to turn his attention at the end of the Cold War to what was going on in Asia. In 1993, he actually wrote a celebrated article called Ripe for Rivalry, in which he discussed what was going on in Asia and what you might expect because of a certain under-institutionalization of Asia and other factors that this would perhaps in time lead to a strategic competition, which I believe is here today and will be the theme of his talk. This finally turned into a book in 2011. It's called A Contest for Supremacy, which I, again, highly recommend to you. This is now about how the United States and China, along the Asian Rim and elsewhere in Asia, are engaged in a strategic contest, which of course has cooperative elements and conflictual elements, and contain his recommendations for what should be done. His most recent monograph is called Beyond Air-Sea Battles. Now he has turned his attention to very detailed issues of the military challenges that the United States faces in the Pacific Rim. And this is an Adelphi paper which just came out last year. So these are his major books. He has authored almost 100 book chapters, journal articles, and commentary articles. So his scholarly output is one that anyone should envy. And as a fellow academic, although I'm not in international relations, I certainly recognize it as, I think, which in his field would be called a Nimitz class output for the large aircraft carriers that the United States Navy likes to build. I mentioned that he is an institution builder. So in 2002, he served as he served as the last director of the Princeton Center for International Studies. This is a institution with some resonance among those who study such matters. Bernard Brodie is a name that is known to some of you. Bharat Karnad is in the audience and actually studied with him some. And Herman Kahn, who wrote on thermonuclear war, actually did this work during a sabbatical at Princeton at the center. So this was sort of, so Aaron was responsible for running that, and then eventually it was decided to replace it, and from 2009 he has been co-director of his successor institution, which he co-created, called the Center for International Security Studies, which at Princeton, which he now co-directs. But outside of the academy, he is one of the founders of something called the Hamilton Society, and this is based on the idea that if the United States is to maintain a certain interest in maintaining a liberal world order, there must be people on its campuses, young men and women, who become engaged in this issue, think about it from an early age, and therefore can eventually form the cadre of the sort of people who go into foreign policy making, strategic matters, international engagement. And so the Hamilton Society, named for Alexander Hamilton, came into existence. I know very much that it was Aaron's idea, and he is very much its founder. Okay, I probably could go on for a while, so in the interest of cutting it short, I'll turn to the last component of his life, which is public service. From 2003 to 2005, he served in the office of the Vice President as the Deputy National Security Advisor at a time when the office of the Vice President in the United States was a major center for policy making. And then he came back. This was an academic leave to Princeton, but then he went back part-time to serve and the Defense Policy Board, which is the Pentagon's advisory panel. And this is, again, a fraction of his activities of this kind, where he serves in various quasi-governmental institutions, advisory capacities, the National Bureau of Asian Research. So really, he has an extremely broad spectrum of things that he does. So all in all, I will again repeat, he's one of America's most distinguished scholars of international relations, but he's also very much a man whose approach to politics, to international politics, I think is one that is very congruent with the aims of this prize. So with that, I will ask now that Ambassador Mansingh perhaps begin the more formal bits of the process by presenting a shawl to our prize honoree, after which I will ask Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi, who happens to be my mother, to present the plaque and the check.
This is a very traditional way of welcoming you.
Okay, and now we'll have the presentation of the plaque and the check for the prize. Now for the last part. At this point, I would ask our chief guest, Sri Dinesh Dwivedi, if he would say a few words.
Namaskar and very good evening. Shivaji has given me a very difficult task. And you know what that is? For a politician to speak a few words. I'm really going to try that, but certainly can't guarantee. I'm actually really deeply touched and truly emotionally moved. The reason I say this is my early days in public life. I had a great connectivity with Professor Sondhi. And today, for me to be chief guest in one of the functions related to Professor Sondhi is a greatest honor I can ever think of. So thank you so much for having me here. Life is all about opportunities. I am home product, make in India. I'm already made in India. We have Professor Aaron, who has come all the way from Princeton. So I'm not going to waste your time. Politicians have a lot of time, so I'm not going to talk about my time. And really keep on talking about things. Although I must express my gratitude once again, and the kind of courage Shivaji had to call me being a politician, that how long I'll take, I'm sure he didn't realize, but I will be very short, and I'm supposed to just pass few remarks. I'm not a scholar, and I can see a lot of gray matters with some gray hair too, and I'm sure any one of you can teach me on the subject I know very little about. I can only say, I met Shivaji in Princeton, thanks to CPR, Ramesh Chandra is sitting here, who took us to Princeton for a week's chit-chat course, and I don't claim to have a degree from Princeton. No pun intended. So that's where I met, and I've had the honor of meeting Professor Aaron too, and I can tell you it's a great opportunity to have him here, and thanks to Mrs. Sondhi, and Professor Lalit Mansingh has already spoken whatever needed to be spoken. As far as India is concerned, I really wonder whether we really know our country and the strength of this country. The day we know about this country, I think we would be on a different planet. I'll just give you one small little example. I used to be the chairman of Indo-EU Parliamentarians Forum. And once in a while, we used to go to Brussels. In one such visit, we were interacting with the members of parliament there. And after whatever speech I had to give, there is Q&A. So one of the parliamentarians asked that, Mr. Trivedi, please tell me, what has changed in India? That the whole world is talking about India, China, India, China. What has changed in India? So I thought for a while. And I said, my dear friend, as far as I am concerned, nothing has changed in India. So he said, what do you mean nothing has changed in India? I said, yes, nothing has changed in India. So he said, please explain to me. I said, please understand, India has been a country of knowledge for thousands of years. India is still a country of knowledge. And in foreseeable future, India will remain a country of knowledge. But what has changed though is your attitude towards India. And the reason your attitude has changed towards India is because this knowledge which we used to always distribute free has a price tag. Patent, intellectual property right. So this knowledge can be bought and sold. And India is a great market. Not only great market, a big source of that knowledge. I've had the opportunity of being in America for a long time. And if one day the doctors of Indian origin says that today is Diwali and today we want chutti, believe me, that day the medical services of United States will come to a standstill. That is what India is all about. Professors, students, look at Shivaji. There are amazing people of Indian origin, Indians, building the whole world. Whether it is NASA, whether it is any big institution, America is what? America is all about research, higher education. You take away the top 20 universities from America and nothing remains. And that is what India used to be. And somewhere down the line, I think we have ourselves forgotten our strength. And we talk about this region. This region is an island, and the world is looking at this island. India has the strength of stability. You look at everywhere around, well, including China. When we compare India, China, sometimes I feel whether it's a comparison at all or not. And that is where I feel this is the century of knowledge. Next big knowledge is going to come from the space program. And this is where I think India has to realize that our kids who are studying abroad, they have so much of knowledge. I'm telling you with my personal knowledge, like, I know so many kids, including my son. They are the brightest of bright, and next move is going to be up in the space. As long as we recognize this strength in us, I think India is going to be much far ahead. We have never strived to be a superpower. I think the moment we think about a superpower, we would be losing our knowledge. I will conclude by saying this, that how much of Indian knowledge, the traditional knowledge, and that traditional knowledge is very scientific knowledge. It's not mumbo jumbo. So other day, my son who's at Stanford, he said, Dad, you know what happened today? I said, what? He said, I had gone with a friend of mine to a doctor. And this friend of mine was suffering from sinus. So I said, so? What's so interesting about it? He said, interesting part is the prescription of the doctor. I said, what did he prescribe? And he was an American doctor. And the prescription was Jal Neti. For your sinus, do Jal Neti. This is an American doctor prescribing. So all I'm trying to suggest is let's understand our strength, our knowledge, and let's be proud of what we are. I was speaking to Professor Arun as we were entering. One of the things which we need to learn is a teamwork. And teamwork is very, very important. You can't even play a game of cricket without a teamwork. So knowledge with teamwork is going to be amazing India. I once again thank you very much, Mrs. Sondhi and Shivaji, for having me here. And I'm sure there is going to be a very interesting talk. India is going to be certainly relevant all over the world. We look forward to your speech. Thank you so very much for coming here. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Dineshji, very much for all your kind words. And now, without further delay, I will ask Professor Friedberg to give us an address.
Mrs. Sondhi, Minister Trivedi, Ambassador Mansingh, trustees, ladies and gentlemen, and of course my dear friend and comrade in arms, Shivaji. Thank you very much for honoring me with this award. I never had the opportunity to meet Professor Sondhi, something that I very much regret, but I know of his work and his remarkable career as a scholar, a public intellectual, as a diplomat, as a member of parliament. It seems to me that he combined the life of the mind with a deep and effective engagement in the public affairs of his day, something which is extremely difficult to do. And it strikes me also that he was well ahead of his time in his vision for the role that his country could play on the international stage and his ideas about the policies that India needed to pursue in order to fulfill its potential. So I'm humbled by this award, and I accept it with true gratitude. My topic this evening is the rapidly evolving relationship between the United States and China. And as Shivaji mentioned, this relationship is mixed. It contains elements of competition, but also of cooperation. But I think it's become increasingly clear, especially in the last several years, that the two countries are engaged in a strategic rivalry. And this rivalry has various dimensions: economic, diplomatic, military. I think there is also an emerging competition in what is sometimes referred to as soft power as well. In fact, this competition or rivalry has been underway for several years, since the end of the Cold War. It's heated up in the last several years, and for reasons that I will try to explain, it's likely to intensify further in the period immediately ahead. Contrary to what's often said, this rivalry is not merely the result of misperceptions or readily correctable policy errors, although those do play a role. Nor does it spring from strategic mistrust that can be dispelled with more dialogue or greater transparency. This mistrust is a symptom and not a cause. Rather, the emerging rivalry between the United States and China springs from two sources. First are the age-old dynamics of power politics. Situations in which you have a state or an empire that has long been dominant in wealth and power, and a fast rising potential challenger closing the gap with it, have traditionally been situations characterized by tension and rivalry, if not always by open conflict. Every year I assign my students to read about 600 pages of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And what I don't tell them is what they really need to know is only one sentence, in which Thucydides says that the deepest cause of the war between Athens and Sparta was the rise or growth of Athenian power and the mistrust that that caused and fear that that caused in Sparta. And in fact, much of what we see today between the United States and China is symptomatic of a similar dynamic. It's easy to see why these situations have been characterized by mistrust and occasionally by conflict. Dominant powers want to protect their privileges, and they fear that rising powers seek to displace them. Rising powers, for their part, typically chafe at institutional structures, hierarchies of prestige, and often territorial boundaries that were put in place when they were relatively weak. Rising powers tend to want their place in the sun, and they fear that dominant powers are intent on frustrating and perhaps crushing them. So that's one factor. And there is a second, which I think doesn't always get the attention that it deserves, and that is ideology. There's a deep and persistent divergence in ideology and institutional structures between the United States and China. I know that one often hears it said that China is no longer truly a communist country. There is no basis for ideological rivalry between the United States and China. It may be true that China's leaders are no longer Marxists. I think that is the case, but they are still very much Leninists. In other words, they believe in the continued rule of China's Communist Party and its dominance of China's political system. They believe that it's essential to their country's future, and they're determined to maintain it. And they regard the United States as a crusading ideological nation that wants to see them, the Communist Party, eventually displaced from power. And in this belief, they're not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, for their part, the American people and their elected representatives are reluctant to trust a regime that they believe suppresses dissent, outlaws meaningful political competition, and strictly regulates the practice of religion. And in my opinion, these misgivings, too, are well placed. So the bottom line is that if we stay on the trajectory that we're currently following, and we may not for a variety of reasons. In other words, if China continues to grow richer and stronger, but it continues to be ruled by a one-party authoritarian regime, the rivalry between the United States and China will intensify. That doesn't mean that conflict is inevitable. I certainly don't believe that it is, but it does suggest that growing tension and heightened competition are quite likely. And indeed, I think what we've seen in the last several years is evidence of this process. To deal with this mixed relationship with China, the United States has evolved a mixed strategy. It's emerged over time. It really goes back to the early 1990s, but it's proven to be quite stable thus far. And it's persisted across Republican and Democratic administrations. If you look at the approach of the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, and now the Obama administration, I think you find more continuity than difference, and I would predict that whoever is elected president of the United States in 2016 will follow a strategy which is broadly similar to that that's been followed for the better part of the last 20 years. American strategy consists of two elements. The first is what I might refer to as engagement. The United States has sought to engage China at all levels through trade, diplomacy, people-to-people exchanges, cultural, scientific, educational exchange, and so on. And the two goals of that aspect of American policy, I think, can be summed up with two words. These are not words that diplomats would use to describe their objectives, but I think they're accurate nonetheless. The first is to tame China, to encourage it to become what was referred to in the previous administration as a responsible stakeholder in the existing international system. And the second part of the goal, or the second goal of this part of American strategy of engagement, I think, has been to encourage, over the long run, liberalizing political developments in China that will eventually help to transform it from an authoritarian regime into a liberal democracy, not through any direct action on the part of the United States or anyone else, but indirectly. So that's the first part of this two-part strategy, engagement. The second is what I would call balancing. In addition to engaging with China, the United States has also taken deliberate steps intended to maintain a favorable balance of power in East Asia. It's bolstered its own air and naval capabilities. Since the end of the Cold War, it has maintained and strengthened its relations with its traditional treaty allies, so Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. And it's also sought, since the 90s, to build new relationships with what I might refer to as quasi-alliance partners, countries with whom the United States doesn't have mutual defense treaties or commitments, but who share with it a number of interests, including a concern over the strategic implications of the growth of Chinese power. And of those countries, in my view, India is far and away the most important and will prove to be the most important in the long run. The goal of this part of U.S. strategy, which is largely unspoken, has been to hold the ring, to preserve the status quo, to discourage the use of force or coercion on the part of China to try to change the distribution of power, and to wait while engagement works its magic on China. For its part, at least until recently, China too has followed a consistent strategy, and its essential idea is embodied in Deng Xiaoping's famous 1991 24-character strategy, the most relevant portion of which is usually translated as something like, we should hide our capabilities and bide our time. This may be starting to change. I'll say more about that in a minute. This basic approach can be broken down into three precepts or axioms. First, avoid confrontation. China overall has sought to avoid confrontation, certainly with more powerful countries, especially with the United States. Its leaders have recognized that they had nothing to gain from such confrontation and a great deal to lose. The second element of China's strategy has been to build up what Chinese analysts and policymakers refer to as China's comprehensive national power. This is a term that analysts use to refer to all of the various elements of national power: economic, technological, diplomatic, and so on. The third aspect of Chinese strategy has been to advance incrementally. I think going back to Tiananmen in 1989 and the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 and 91, Chinese strategists felt that they were on the defensive, that they were relatively weak in relation to the United States and the West, but that didn't mean that they could afford to remain passive. Instead, over this period of time, they've consistently sought for ways to strengthen their own position and, where possible, to weaken the position of the United States in Asia. So what are the ultimate goals of this three-part Chinese strategy? This is not something that's openly discussed in China, but I believe that the objectives of China's current leaders and of their most likely successors, in other words, assuming the Communist Party remains in power, can be summarized in the following way. First and foremost, to preserve the exclusive grip on political power of the CCP. In my view, this is the aim, ultimately, of every aspect of Chinese policy, foreign and domestic. As an extension of that, China's rulers seek, in a sense, to make the world safe for authoritarianism, or at least to make Asia safe for a CCP-ruled China. And doing this requires, in the long run, that China displace the United States as the preponderant regional power. The United States and its democratic friends and allies pose an ideological as well as a geopolitical threat to China. But from a Chinese perspective, the United States is an interloper in the region. It's a relatively recent arrival whose position depends on a handful of what the Chinese refer to as unequal treaties with countries like Japan and South Korea. And these are unnatural. In the Chinese view, these are relics of the Cold War. They won't and shouldn't last forever. And as the presence of the United States dwindles, China can resume its rightful place, in this view, as the dominant power in the region. Now, Chinese strategists don't believe that they can accomplish this goal quickly or through a sort of frontal assault. Their hope is to win without fighting, the term that the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu used to express the ultimate objective of the highest form of strategy. Maintaining good relations with the United States, if at all possible, while building up China's power, damping down any tendencies on the part of the US or its regional friends and allies to build their own capabilities or to cooperate more closely in order to counter China's growing strength, gradually weakening the foundation of America's alliances, and eventually creating a situation in which overt resistance to China's wishes will appear futile. And regional powers will have little choice but to reach the best possible accommodation that they can with China. Now, these are ambitious goals, and it's by no means obvious that China will be able to achieve them. But barring some fundamental change in the character of its domestic regime, I believe that this is the direction in which it is likely to continue to move. Let me say a few words about the developments of the last several years, particularly since the beginning of the Obama administration. The administration came into office in 2009 intending to maintain the basic approach of combining engagement with balancing. But I think they believed at the outset that it was possible to alter the mix of these two elements somewhat, and basically to enhance and broaden engagement, while at the same time, if not abandoning, at least downplaying the balancing part of US strategy. And that was their initial attitude in approaching China. But starting almost immediately in the latter part of 2009 and then in 2010, this approach encountered a series of setbacks. China was seen not only in the United States, but throughout Asia, to be behaving more assertively across a wide range of fronts, especially, although not exclusively, in its disputes over maritime issues with its East Asian, Western Pacific neighbors. By 2010, the Obama administration had begun to respond to these Chinese actions and to the anxiety they caused in the region by increasing its emphasis on the balancing side of US strategy. So they went from trying to increase the engagement and downplay balancing to playing up the balancing and to some extent downplaying engagement. And this culminated in the proclamation of the so-called pivot, or as it was referred to also at the time, the American return to Asia. Some of my colleagues who served with me in the Bush administration were very aggravated about this. One of them said to me, if we were gone from Asia, how do I explain to my wife what I was doing at the office for 14 hours a day? And of course now, having recognized that the language of the pivot has some problems attached to it, the administration has settled on a kind of bland accounting term, rebalancing, to describe what it's doing. And these words have been accompanied by some deeds, increasing forward deployment of US forces in the region, including the deployment of a small number of Marines to Australia, littoral combat ships to Singapore, the opening of negotiations for a new free trade area, the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an economic arrangement, yes, but has strategic rationales behind it as well. The end of 2012 saw the re-election of President Obama and also the elevation of a new Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, to positions as president of the Chinese state and also general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And at the time, so 3 years ago, there were questions about the continuing commitment of the Obama administration in its second term. There were changes in personnel, people who were responsible or seemed to be responsible for the policies of the time left, including Secretary Clinton herself. There were clearly resource constraints. There began to be some challenges to the wisdom of the pivot, especially from so-called China hands, some of whom argued that it was unnecessary, that it was overstated, it might be provocative, and so on. And also there were other events, especially in the Middle East, and somewhat later, of course, in the Ukraine. I think if there were questions, they've essentially been answered. The administration undoubtedly remains committed to the rebalance to Asia, but it has been constrained and preoccupied. Regarding China, as Xi Jinping came into office, the question was whether the assertive behavior of the previous several years was an aberration, whether it was the product of temporary transient forces, or to the contrary, whether it might represent the wave of the future, and if so, what might be driving it. And there were a number of views. One view was perhaps some of what we saw in 2010, 2011, this assertive behavior was part of the run-up to the 2012 succession process in China, some people maneuvering and wanting to take a tough stand on foreign policy in order to better their chances of being elevated to higher positions. Some analysts in the West have argued also that China's behavior was really not assertive, it was more reactive, it was responding to actions by others. Another explanation put forward by some American observers and others is that while China's behavior was troublesome, it was not really strategic in its motivation. It was driven largely by internal, domestic political pressures, popular nationalism, supposedly rogue PLA officers who were pushing for a harder line, perhaps the addition of new bureaucratic actors like maritime security agencies, which may have seen their interests as lying in more tension as a way of getting their own budgets increased, and so on. And all of this, in the view of some, had been enabled by the weak collective leadership towards the end of Hu Jintao's administration, and there was some expectation, Xi Jinping coming into office, perhaps these policies would be dialed back. Well, that is not what's happened. To the contrary. With the passage of time, all of these claims, I think, have become increasingly difficult to sustain. Beijing's recent behavior appears to be deliberate, purposeful, and coordinated, although it suggests, in my view, an adjustment in tactics and timelines rather than a fundamental shift in strategy. China is pushing harder to achieve its long-standing goal of expanding its own regional power and influence while constricting the power and influence and position of the United States. In addition to advancing its claims to control most of the water and resources off its coasts, Beijing has been using calibrated threats in an attempt to intimidate its neighbors, to demonstrate the inadequacy of U.S. security guarantees, and if possible, to drive wedges between the United States and some of its regional friends and allies. And in addition to everything that it's doing in the Pacific, it's also begun a major push inland, the so-called New Silk Road, a set of very ambitious investment projects that could transform the infrastructure and economy of Central Asia, reaching down into South Asia and all the way to Europe and the Persian Gulf. China's increased assertiveness in recent years reflects a mix of arrogance and insecurity. Following the onset of the global financial crisis, many Chinese analysts and policymakers concluded that the United States had entered into a period of unexpectedly rapid decline in its relative power and influence. And with their country's fortunes seemingly on the rise, some argued that the time had come for China, if not to abandon the strategy of hiding capabilities and biding time that had been advocated by Deng Xiaoping, then at least to adopt a more forward-leaning posture in its dealings with the rest of the world. Chinese planners appear to have concluded that at least in the next several years, the United States will continue to be strategically preoccupied and fiscally constrained. And I believe they have concluded also that if they play their cards right during this period, they can create facts and consolidate their own position. But this near-term confidence is mixed with a longer-term concern. Among other factors, slowing economic growth has become quite evident in the last several years, and continuing revelations about the extent and depth of official corruption, which Xi Jinping himself has drawn attention to. His anti-corruption campaign is the key part of his domestic program. These combined could threaten internal stability and potentially even regime survival. A more assertive stance may enable Beijing to achieve victories that contribute to this idea of national rejuvenation, the achievement of the great Chinese dream, and thereby enhance the CCP's legitimacy by casting it as the defender of China's honor and greatness. Regardless of the results, however, the regime appears to believe that an atmosphere of increased tension and friction with at least some of its foreign rivals can help it to rally support and deflect possible public resentment against its own inadequacies and failings. In the long run, China's assertiveness could turn out to be counterproductive and even self-defeating. If its Asian neighbors respond by increasing their own capabilities and working more closely with one another and with the United States, they may be able to balance China's growing power and to block its initiatives. But such an outcome is not inevitable or automatic. In the absence of an effective response from the United States, but also from others, China may yet be able to successfully pursue a divide and conquer strategy, intimidating some of its neighbors into acquiescence while isolating and demoralizing others. Indeed, this appears to be exactly what Beijing is now trying to do, reaching out to Washington, proclaiming its desire to form a new type great power relationship with the United States, while at the same time ratcheting up pressure on some key targets, especially US allies like Japan and the Philippines, but also Vietnam. So how should the United States respond to China's increasing assertiveness? It is neither feasible nor at this point necessary to abandon our mixed strategy in favor of something radically different. What's required instead is a readjustment of the blending of the two elements, and in particular, in my view, an increased emphasis on the balancing portion of America's strategic portfolio. I think the current administration had the right idea with the pivot, but its efforts to date have been and are widely perceived in the region to be inadequate. And I think there is growing concern on the part of at least some U.S. friends and allies that despite the rhetoric of its leaders, the United States may lack the resources, the focus, and perhaps the resolve necessary to withstand Chinese pressure and sustain a position of leadership. And these concerns, in my view, have been fed by the perceived inadequacy of some recent American responses to crises in other regions, as well as events in Asia. So I think the next administration is going to have to find ways to signal U.S. commitment to stand by America's friends and allies, even at the risk of antagonizing and annoying China, as it inevitably will, to help our friends and allies strengthen their own capabilities, to encourage them to work more closely with one another, and last but not least, to strengthen our own military capabilities, which will require us to address some of our underlying fiscal problems, which are serious at the moment. We have to do all of this, I think, even as we continue to engage China, to look for ways to cooperate where we can, and await the eventual emergence of a more transparent, representative, and democratic regime. In my opinion, that would be the best thing for the Chinese people, but it would also be the best thing for the long-term prospects for peace and stability in Asia. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Professor Friedberg, for that excellent and lucid presentation. We have time to take questions from the audience, and if that microphone in front of you will work, you can take them from where you are. So at this point, we'll start with the person over there, and then second. Yes, please. I don't. There isn't a mic in the audience, is it, that we have?
I think just speak loudly.
Recently, I had read about Hugh White's book, the Australian professor. He argues that the U.S. grand strategy is that that U.S. wants to turn China into another Japan, in the sense that it will trust the U.S. to assure its security in the region and also not let powers like Japan threaten it, etc. So he argues that that is an impossible dream, and hence his prescription is that US should have a concert of powers instead of balancing actively. So my question is that my reading of your work in general is that you seem to think that that is possible indeed, that the China might give up its competition with the US, it will forsake a sphere of influence because it would realize that the alternative is not that bad, in a sense that absent American presence in the region, there would be greater Japanese preponderance. And so how much of a factor is that, the Japan card in a certain sense? And regarding the same question, I was wondering, what is the Obama administration's outlook towards Shinzo Abe's government? It's trying to be more active. Is it still within the framework of American alliance, or is Japan trying to be an independent power of some sort?
Thank you. Those are very good questions and complicated questions. If I could, just my interpretation of Professor White's views, and he's a good friend of mine, a very nice man. I keep telling him he's such a nice guy. How could he be so wrong? I think this idea that there could be a concert of powers assumes a degree of trust and cooperation and a convergence of interests between the United States and China, which is simply not there for reasons that I suggested. The notion that there can be spheres of influence in some way, that China can have its domain and the United States will have its, is also problematic for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that within what China is likely to regard as its sphere of influence reside America's key allies in the region, including South Korea and Japan, and also countries to which it has historic ties like Taiwan, or I shouldn't say countries, actors. Also, one of the things that strikes me as problematic about this view is the notion that Chinese leadership that believes that its power is growing has very little incentive to accept an arrangement based on the current distribution of power, when if it waits, it may believe that it can get more. And I think that's actually the thinking now in Beijing. As far as the question of Japan and whether China is worried about a Japanese threat, I don't think one can entirely dismiss this, and certainly there is a great deal of animosity towards Japan. But I think the idea that the Chinese are deathly afraid of a renewed Japanese hostility or aggression is exaggerated. In fact, if you look at what some Chinese analysts are now saying, they're not exactly contemptuous or dismissive of Japan, but they note that Japan's economy is growing very slowly, its population is shrinking. I think they believe in the long run their own position will improve in relation to Japan. And if not for the United States, Japan would have to come to terms with China. As far as the US attitude towards the Abe government, I think it's, you have to distinguish between some of the things that the government and Mr. Abe himself in particular have said and what they're doing. I think most people in the US government and the sort of Asia specialist community are supportive of what Mr. Abe is doing, increasing defense capabilities, trying to enable Japan to cooperate in a more normal way with the United States as its ally, trying to cooperate also on strategic issues with South Korea, with India, with Australia. What they're uncomfortable about is the rhetoric and the language that Mr. Abe and some others in his administration occasionally use on the so-called history issues. And in this, they're not alone. I mean, the concerns about American officials are echoed, in my experience, by those of some people in the Japanese system, professionals in the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who wish that Mr. Abe would simply drop some of the rhetoric and references to history. They recognize that it only complicates Japan's situation and makes it more difficult to cooperate more closely with the countries with whom it should be cooperating. But I don't think there's any fear that the Abe government is going to behave irresponsibly or recklessly, or that it's somehow seized with irrational nationalism and a risk to the United States. I don't think that's the view.
Yes, thanks, Shivaji. Rohit Jha. I had the good fortune of listening to Shivaji, you, and I can see Raja Menon here, all three of you yesterday. And we were talking yesterday in the context of pre-2030 and post-2030 scenarios in global politics. Now my question is, and there are certain assumptions and there are certain projections which have been made by various people that China could overtake the US post-2030. Now my question is, if we were to assume that that projection is correct, what will be the three factors, in your opinion, and I'm restricting it to just three, which would maybe help China overtake the US?
Well, restricting it to three, I feel a little bit like one of my students. This is a bit like a question I would ask them, so I'm going to do what they sometimes do, which is try to answer your question without giving you three, because I don't know that I can break it down to that. Well, first of all, I think we have to take seriously the likelihood that if China continues on something resembling its current growth trajectory, eventually its total output of goods and services will exceed that of the United States. However, that's measured, which, as you know, is a controversial issue. I think the date at which that is going to happen may be further out in the future than some people have been saying, particularly if current trends are carried forward. Chinese economic growth, as you know, is down to about 7.25%, which of course is enviable in most respects if we take the official statistics as legitimate. But that's the slowest rate of growth that China has had in the last 25 years. Some people believe that it's actually slower and that it could be headed downwards fairly steeply. If that turns out to be true, of course, it pushes out the date at which China might overtake the United States. Even when that day comes, of course, China will be, by comparison to the United States, still a relatively poor country because it has a population 4 times as large, so the per capita GDP will be a quarter that of the United States. Moreover, I think there are some reasons to believe that the pressures within China for increased spending on social welfare, healthcare, environmental pollution are going to grow. The population is beginning to age rapidly. So I think there will not be the simple ability to write checks to the military that we've seen over the last 20 years. China has been engaged in a very ambitious expansion of its military capabilities, which essentially has been burden-free. It hasn't increased the burden on the Chinese population. The percentage of GDP devoted to defense has not gone up very much because even as the defense budget has grown, the economy has grown almost as fast. If the economy slows down, it's going to be more difficult to do that, and there will be more difficult trade-offs to be made. So that perhaps doesn't answer your question, but I think we have to be a little bit skeptical and not fixate on these numbers and this supposed transition dates. I guess the last thing I would mention, I worked on a study for the Defense Department this summer using publicly available information, and we did a number of different scenarios making different assumptions about Chinese and American growth, which I think are not dramatically off, but also about the GDPs of other countries, allies and friends of the United States. And of course, when you include those in the balance, it's much less favorable for China and much more favorable from an American perspective. A real source of strength, and this has historically been true, and I think it will be even more true in the future, especially in Asia. Strength for the United States has been its alliances and its friends, and I think that that will continue to be true even if China continues to grow richer and stronger, which I believe it will, although perhaps not at the rate that we've seen in recent years.
Go ahead. First.
Sir, you spoke of American strategy, the first element being engagement
Yes.
with China. When people like me who are not well as much educated and informed as you are, then we look back and see things from a distance now. We saw in 70s President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. I don't know whether it was a misplaced fear of USSR or whatever reasons they had, they started engagement with China much before USSR fell down. But the net result, as we now look back and measure it, is that by engaging with China, America gave, number one, credibility to China, which it appears it did not deserve at that time. It gave it the respect on the international platform, which it could not have won the way China has been moving for decades. Then it gave China technology, investment, production facilities, and your own market. You even provided them the market. So I'm afraid that all this has given something like the economic power, military power, political arrogance, everything to China, that we see a new Frankenstein emerging. How would you comment on that? Because I am afraid maybe American history might judge these two leaders as the greatest disaster of America in this period.
Well, I think some people already believe that, but for other reasons. I don't happen to be one of them. But I would divide American attitudes towards China into two periods. The first really is from the beginning of the so-called opening to China, which starts when President Nixon comes into office with first National Security Advisor Kissinger and then Secretary of State Kissinger. And then the motivations really were strategic, as you suggest. I think they were mixed. They thought that China was going to help the U.S. get out of Vietnam. They also believed that China could help the U.S. induce the Soviets to enter into arms control. I think in retrospect, Dr. Kissinger describes it as part of a strategy for bringing down the Soviet Union, though I don't think that that was the way it was seen at the time. It was more a balancing exercise. And China at that time was so far behind that I don't think anyone dreamed of the situation we see now. And probably we were, if not naive, we perhaps didn't think through fully the consequences of some of the things that went on, but it was in the context of the Cold War. And in that context, it was part of a successful strategy, ultimately, for ending the Cold War and bringing down the Soviet Union. So that's the first phase. The second phase really comes after 1989, so after Tiananmen. And there's a sequence of events that unfold very rapidly, the Tiananmen Square massacre, then the fall of the Berlin Wall, and ultimately within 2 years, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And that really had two effects. One, it removed this strategic rationale for close cooperation with China. The Soviets are no longer there. Why is it exactly that we're exchanging and cooperating so closely with the Chinese? And also, it reminded people in the United States of the true character of the Chinese regime. And Nixon and Kissinger, I don't think, had illusions about it, but they didn't talk very much about the character of the Chinese regime under Mao. But after Tiananmen, it became impossible to ignore that. And the ideological component, which had been suppressed, I think, by strategic considerations, reemerged. And the U.S. relationship with China has, on the strategic plane, been much more remote, of course, since then. On the economic plane, however, we've redoubled and doubled down on what has emerged, I think, as a bet, a gamble, that by engaging with China economically, by doing all of the things that you say, we will encourage China to see its interests as lying in the maintenance of the stability of a liberal international order, and, although people don't talk about this quite as much, that it would bring quickly in its train political transformation in China. You have to think back to the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think there were people who believed at the time that China was going to move fairly quickly in the direction of liberalization. So there was a bit of wishful thinking. And I believe what's happened in the United States in the last 10 years or so is that it has begun to sink in that China can do something which, in theory, many people in the United States thought was impossible, which is to maintain growth and at the same time preserve an authoritarian political system. In the long run, the people who said that wasn't possible may turn out to be right. I think they probably will be. The question is, how long is the long run, and what's going to happen between where we are now and where we're headed? No country has done more to enable China's growth than the United States. When Chinese analysts and political leaders accuse the United States of containing it, it's almost laughable. The United States has done the opposite of containing China. And it's conceivable that we may regret it, but I think most people in the US still have this hope that eventually this will come out in the right place. And that the alternative, trying to contain and control China, was not a viable policy in the long run.
Unfortunately, we are paying for your mistakes.
Well, I don't know about that. We're trying to be helpful.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Professor, for all our bonhomie recent with US, why is it that we are never getting a support for a seat in the Security Council when we did support China to become a member of the Security Council? Now, secondly, since your lecture was all of US and China influence and competitive in cooperation, I think China has, would not like, somebody there mentioned that China would like to deter Japan's influence in the Asian region, but I think that could not happen because U.S. already has its military footholds through Diego Garcia and Okinawa in Japan, and I don't think China would want any other military influence or otherwise in the Asian region. Can you comment on these
Yes,
two?
thank you. On the first, I think, of course, many people in the United States do support a UN Security Council seat for India and also for Japan. The problem is China is not going to agree to that. So I think there's no argument, many people in the United States, that that would be an appropriate thing, especially given India's increasing influence, wealth, and power. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen as long as the Chinese have the capacity to prevent it. You mentioned U.S. footholds, and I'm not sure if I understood the question, but it may be related to the earlier point, and that is the argument that China would rather have the United States in these positions of strength along its periphery than deal with independent emerging powers or powers like Japan. I think that may be true, but it probably is becoming less true with the passage of time. It may have been true that when China was relatively weak, it saw the alliance between the United States and Japan as a useful way of containing and controlling the growth of Japanese power. But if that was the utility of the alliance, it would appear that from a Chinese perspective, it has lost much of that utility because now, of course, Japan is increasing its own strength. So I don't think China would want to have the United States gone tomorrow, but I do think over the long run, and they say this, they believe that the U.S. presence, U.S. alliances are relics of the Cold War and should eventually dissolve.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that India plays a relatively secondary role versus the U.S. relationship with Japan and South Korea and so on. But what do you see as India's role in moderating and evolving China's own policies, its ideology? The Chinese generally, would you like India to engage more economically, or do you think we should have a more assertive stance and align more with the US? And the way I see it, the Chinese have not actually engaged in any armed conflict. And most of their assertion has come in the form of building infrastructure to a lot of countries around India. And that seems to be a very positive way of doing it. The negative way of doing it is to enter into some kind of arms race with the US, where both sides pile in arms into different countries and therefore encourage conflicts. So what do you think is India's role and how should it deal with China? Should we be more assertive or engage with them more economically? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the last point, of course, China has not just been building infrastructure, it's been supplying arms up to and including nuclear arms to India's neighbor Pakistan for many years. So I don't think that what they're doing is simply as you describe. Moreover, I would say that this very ambitious infrastructure development initiative, first of all, it may not work in the way the Chinese imagine. It could be very costly. But I do think it's part of a larger strategic effort on China's part, not only to help the development of its neighbors, but to gain access to resources, to gain political influence, to open routes of communication which might allow it to bypass the narrow straits around Singapore, to counterbalance India and contain India. I think it is part of a strategy that has that also as a goal. As far as whether India should engage or align more closely with the United States, I don't think those are binary, that is a binary choice. It seems to me that what India is trying to do is both to engage more closely with China on the economic front and diplomatically, and also to take steps to maintain India's position and the balance of power in this region relative to China as it grows stronger. And that part of that, only part of it, is to cooperate more closely with the United States, but not only with the US, with Japan and Australia and other countries. And that seems to me a very sensible approach. And I hope that that's the one that will continue. It seems that the current administration here has that as its goal. I think that makes sense. It does involve elements of a similar gamble. We have to acknowledge that greater trade and economic cooperation and so on does help China grow, but it also presumably helps India grow too.
How serious is this not openly, there are signs, but not openly, about disagreements, if we can use that word, between the PLA and the civilian leadership? Like last year when the president was in India, that is exactly the moment that the PLA decided to move troops across the line of actual control, which they didn't have to do it at that time, whatever the perception and differences were. But were they trying to assert some kind of make a point which trying to indicate that they would like to have their own independent viewpoint, and even though she might be in charge of the chairman of the CNC, would they prefer a different kind of line rather than what the civilian leadership is following?
Well, I don't know that, and I don't know anyone who does know it. This is we're talking about things that are very tightly held. Just on the point that you mentioned of crossing the line of control when she was visiting, this is characteristic of Chinese behavior. Testing weapons when foreign dignitaries are visiting and doing this kind of thing when their leaders are going elsewhere. That is not, in my view, an indication of the independence of the PLA. It's the PLA following the script and integrating its actions with China's diplomacy. And overall, I think that is the consistent pattern. I don't see evidence of sharp disagreements between the military and the political leadership. In fact, to the contrary, there's certain irony in this. When Xi Jinping was emerging, people said, oh, well, he has these ties to the PLA. That means he'll be able to control them. Well, it turns out, it seems to mean that he has views that are quite similar to theirs. And the congruence between what he seems to want to do and what the military wants seems to be quite high. The PLA is still a party army, and I don't see any indication that there's been any attempt to challenge or question that. Now, having said all of that, there is one caveat, which is, as I mentioned, she has initiated this very aggressive anti-corruption campaign, which targets people high up in the party, in the state bureaucracies, and also in the military. And some people have suggested, and I think there's some validity to this, that this is a potentially quite dangerous strategy for him to pursue. I think he's doing it partly because he's using it as a tool to go after his own enemies, partly because he recognizes that in order to bolster the legitimacy of the regime, he has to be seen by the people to be going after the so-called tigers and not only the flies. But he's making enemies, no doubt about it, first. Secondly, and this is, I think, maybe the less obvious point, I have some difficulty imagining, seeing how he's going to wind this down. It seems to me he may be pulling on a thread here, which, instead of bolstering the legitimacy of the regime, winds up weakening it even further. Because in the last several years, since the Bojilai episode, the fiction, which had been maintained previously, that there was low-level corruption, but up at the top, everybody was clean, has now been completely exposed. Everyone knows that there's corruption up to the very highest levels. And just going after a few hundred or even a few thousand officials and then announcing that corruption has been done away with is not going to work, because the root cause of the corruption is the nature of the political system. Unless you have an independent judiciary, an independent investigative arm, independent police power that is regulated by the courts and not by political leaders, you're going to have corruption. It is baked into the authoritarian Chinese system. And I don't see how he's going to flip the switch, having initiated this process. And I think it could, in the long run, contribute to the unraveling of the regime.
I just ask a follow-up question.
Please.
We have all those things you mentioned in India.
Which things?
Judiciary,
Yes,
political system,
right,
bureaucracy,
right.
all what you mentioned. We have everything in India. But we also have corruption.
That's true, and there's corruption in every advanced society. But I think the scale and level of the corruption in China and the extent to which it's integral to the economic policies of the regime is unprecedented. And this also is a difficulty for Xi Jinping as he tries to implement economic reforms. Chinese experts and officials have known and acknowledged for over a decade that China needs to fundamentally shift its economic development model away from this emphasis on investment and exports and towards increased consumption. They haven't been able to do it thus far, and the reason, I think, is in part that the current system benefits people in the party, in the state-owned enterprises, from top to bottom through corruption. And so there's going to be great resistance to fundamental changes in that model from people whose livelihoods depend on its perpetuation. So I think the extent of corruption and the extent to which it's integral to the system is qualitatively different in China than in other countries, even countries with very high levels of corruption.
Mr. John? Yeah. Please.
Friedberg, I'm rather attracted by the idea of concept. I know you're going to tell me probably at the end of this, how could you be so wrong? But I'm going to read Professor White's. I tell you why I feel this. It's the change in the nature of economic interactions in the world. I mean, the Chinese today are so deeply dependent upon the prosperity of Japan, the prosperity of the US, the prosperity of Europe. You know, that to go down the road of traditional challenge, you know, hegemonic challenge, would be actually suicidal for them. And they're very much aware of this. And I think that U.S. foreign policy shows a very fine awareness of this, and I must say it is extraordinarily well tuned. I was just thinking, Japan has 23,000 companies in China, working in China, employing 11 million people. I mean, how can the Chinese think of confrontation beyond a point with Japan? Therefore, but given therefore that the U.S. is following a very patient and I think constructive thing to China, where do you feel? What I'd like to ask you is, how will the U.S. react is it necessary for China to democratize as it gets old, richer, or can the U.S. accept to live with this rather muddled and rather corrupt and authoritarian China? Because it seems to me the Chinese are far more comfortable with this than we realize, because it's not very far away from the structure of Confucianism that they've always known.
Well, there are, again, many questions wrapped up in one. On the last point, the United States has lived with and dealt with and engaged an authoritarian China for the last 40 years, and I think will continue to do so. It's not that that's unacceptable or impossible. Of course, for some years prior to the recognition of the CCP regime, the United States refused to recognize China. We're not going back to that. The question is more, I think, whether there can be a stable, lasting, truly cooperative relationship between a country constituted as China currently is and a country like the United States. And for reasons I suggested, I think the answer is no. And it's not just a question of American attitudes towards China. It's also, and maybe even more so, Chinese attitudes towards the United States, which are deeply mistrustful, opportunistic, yes, taking advantage of all the things that the United States is willing to do with and for China, while at the same time pursuing China's own interests and the CCP pursuing its own interests. That's really the reason why I'm skeptical of this idea of a concert. A concert assumes a convergence of interest sufficient to allow deepening cooperation.
But doesn't economic integration give you precisely that? This is what we didn't have 100 years ago at the end of the British transition.
Well, that's actually not the case. There was very extensive economic interdependence between Britain and Germany in particular at the end of the 20th century. It didn't prevent conflict. Now, I would say that I think the Chinese recognize the advantages that they obtain under the current system, and they don't want to disrupt it. I don't think they're about to invade and conquer their neighbors. That's not the way that they see themselves operating or want to operate. However, what worries me more is the unintended consequences of the policies that I described as being motivated in part by a desire to maintain domestic legitimacy and control. And the example of Japan is a very useful one. It doesn't make sense economically for China to have been as aggressive towards Japan as it's been, and it's starting to have real effects. Japanese companies are looking for other places to put their factories. The political risk is seen by many as being too high. Chinese will pay a price for the way in which they've chosen to treat the Japanese, but I don't think that means they're going to stop, because I think the advantages as they perceive them in terms of legitimacy of holding Japan up as an enemy are too great. And that's a very dangerous situation. It suggests the possibility of unintended conflict and escalation. And I think that's more the concern. I guess I would say in the longer run, I did say in passing that although I described Chinese goals as I see them as being very ambitious, I also said they may be impossible to achieve. And I don't know that the Chinese have a kind of end game of all of this. And there may be deep contradictions in what they're trying to do. I think there are. But for the moment, at least, they're trying to use economic instruments both to enhance their wealth and also to increase their power and their influence. I think they are trying to build a system, an order in Asia, which is different than the liberal order that the United States has presided over for the last 60 or 70 years, and will be Sinocentric. It will consist of economic arrangements, which include a set of countries around China but exclude others, particularly the United States, infrastructure projects that will link the region together, but in which all roads will, in a sense, lead to Beijing, and on political institutions on top of that. And we've seen Chinese efforts to create these institutions. They haven't succeeded as much as the Chinese would like, but which, again, exclude outside powers, as the Chinese would see them, and therefore make them the most powerful actor. I think there's an evolving, emerging vision of how they would like this region to look, and the question is whether it's achievable. I don't know that it is, but they think they can have their cake and eat it too, and they're trying.
I'm going to do something which it's a practice from physics seminars, which is I would like to bring the formal proceedings to an end, but Professor Friedberg will still be around, and the couple of people who had their hands up, I would encourage them to just come up and continue the conversation, but then there are people who would probably at this point like to escape, and I think it's only fair that we allow them to do that. So I'm going to ask Mrs. Burman Chandra, convener of the prize committee, to please come and give a vote of thanks.
Friends, on behalf of the Professor M.L. Sondhi Memorial Trust and the M.L. Sondhi Institute for Asia-Pacific Affairs, I wish to offer our deepest thanks and appreciation to Professor Dr. Aaron Friedberg, who most graciously consented to be here to receive the M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics 2013. As you know already, he doesn't need any introduction to this informed audience, but I must say his lecture was amazingly refreshing, and the Q&A has made it all the more worthwhile. We are also grateful to Honorable Shri Dinesh Trivedi former Minister of Railways, for sparing his valuable time to be here with us as the chief guest at the function. Some of his remarks were very encouraging, particularly to those who believe in knowledge as power. Our sincere gratitude and appreciation goes to former Foreign Secretary Sri Lalit Mansingh, Professor Shivaji L. Sondhi, Professor of Physics in Princeton University, and above all, Srimati Madhuri Sondhi, the prime mover and motivator of this entire program, for gracing this occasion. We deeply appreciate the presence of the distinguished guests in this function and to all those who have participated to make it a great success. Our sincere thanks also to the Habitat Center and their staff who helped in arranging this ceremony. Once again, thank you to all of you. Just a minute. Habitat Center. Okay. Thank you once again. It was a grand function. I wanted to be as short as possible so that we go back with a good taste in our mind. We have a lot of takeaways to think about. Thank you.